The rain hammered against the makeshift medical tent as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera pulled his gloves tight. Another convoy had been hit by an improvised explosive device just outside Kandahar, and the wounded were already being rushed in. The familiar chaos of a field hospital filled his ears: shouted orders, the steady beep of monitors, and the low moans of injured soldiers fighting for their lives. Marcus had seen it all before. 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless wounded warriors passing through his hands. As a Navy SEAL medic, he'd learned to compartmentalize the horror, to focus purely on the medical task at hand. Save who you can, stabilize the rest, move on to the next patient. It was a brutal efficiency born from necessity. The first stretcher came through the tent flaps carried by 2 Marines whose uniforms were still smoking from the explosion. The patient was unconscious, blood seeping through field dressings wrapped hastily around the torso. Marcus glanced at the dog tags. Corporal Sarah Chen, 22 years old, from a logistics unit that had been escorting supplies to a forward operating base. Something immediately struck him as unusual. Despite the severity of her injuries, there was no sound coming from the young soldier. Most blast victims were either unconscious or crying out in pain, but Chen lay completely silent, her jaw clenched tight even in her unconscious state. Her breathing was shallow but controlled, almost disciplined. Marcus began his assessment, cutting away the torn uniform to expose the wounds. Shrapnel had peppered her left side, and there was significant trauma to her shoulder and arm. As he worked, cleaning and examining each wound, he noticed something that made him pause. The muscle definition in her arms and core was remarkable. Not just fit, but the kind of conditioning that came from specialized training. Her hands told another story. Calluses in specific patterns that Marcus recognized from his own SEAL training. Rope burns on her palms that were weeks old, indicating recent fast roping exercises. Most telling were the small scars on her knuckles, and the barely visible tan lines that suggested she'd been wearing different gear than standard Army issue. As Marcus stabilized her vitals and began suturing the deeper lacerations, Chen's eyes fluttered open. Despite the pain medication he'd administered, her gaze was sharp and focused. She looked around the tent, assessing threats and exits in a way that civilian casualties never did. When their eyes met, Marcus saw something he recognized: the controlled alertness of someone trained for special operations. Chen tried to sit up, but Marcus gently pushed her back down. "Easy there, Corporal. You've been through hell, but you're going to be fine," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of treating combat wounds. She nodded once but said nothing. No questions about her condition, no requests to contact family, no complaints about pain, just the steady, measured breathing of someone maintaining operational discipline even while wounded. Marcus had treated enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs, but Chen was listed as logistics support. Something didn't add up. As he continued working, Marcus noticed other details that didn't fit with her official military occupation specialty. Her physical conditioning was beyond what any logistics soldier would maintain. The way she instinctively positioned herself on the stretcher showed tactical awareness. Even her silence spoke volumes. This wasn't someone overwhelmed by trauma, but someone maintaining operational security even while seriously injured. The tent fell unusually quiet as other medics and nurses began to notice the strange calm emanating from the young soldier. In a place where wounded warriors often cried out for their mothers or cursed their luck, Chen's disciplined silence created an atmosphere that made everyone pause in their work. Marcus finished cleaning the last wound and began applying fresh dressings. As he worked, he caught Chen studying the other patients in the tent, her eyes cataloging information with the systematic approach of someone trained in intelligence gathering. When she realized he was watching her, she quickly looked away, but not before Marcus caught the calculating look in her eyes. "Corporal Chen," Marcus said quietly, leaning closer so only she could hear, "is there anything you need me to know about your medical history? Any previous injuries or conditions that might affect your treatment?" She met his gaze directly, and for a moment Marcus saw something flicker in her expression, a brief internal debate about whether to trust him. Then her face returned to its mask of disciplined neutrality. "No, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. "Standard medical history. No complications." But Marcus had spent enough time around special operations personnel to know when someone was maintaining cover, even while wounded. The way she'd answered, the careful phrasing, the slight emphasis on standard, it all suggested that Corporal Sarah Chen was far more than just another logistics soldier who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As he finished her initial treatment and prepared to move her to the evacuation helicopter, Marcus made a decision. He would keep his suspicions to himself for now, but he would also keep watching. In the dangerous game of special operations, even medical personnel needed to know when they were treating. Someone whose official cover story didn't match the evidence their training had taught them to recognize the silence that had settled over the tent when Chen arrived remained as she was prepared for transport. It was the kind of quiet that comes when professionals recognize one of their own, even when that recognition raises more questions than it answers. The medical evacuation helicopter lifted off into the dusty Afghan sky, carrying Sarah Chen and 3 other wounded soldiers toward the trauma center in Bagram. Marcus watched from the landing zone until the aircraft disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. But his mind remained focused on the quiet soldier who'd said so little while revealing so much. 2 days later, Marcus received an unexpected visit. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison from Joint Special Operations Command appeared at the field hospital, his presence immediately drawing attention from the medical staff. JSOC officers didn't typically visit forward aid stations unless something significant was happening. Sergeant Rivera, Harrison said, pulling Marcus aside from his duties. I understand you treated Corporal Chen from the convoy attack 2 days ago. I need to ask you some questions about her condition and your observations during treatment. Marcus had been expecting this conversation since the moment he'd noticed Chen's unusual characteristics. In the world of special operations, medical personnel often found themselves in positions where they needed to protect operational security while providing proper care. Sir, patient confidentiality requires that I limit what I can discuss about any individual's medical treatment. Marcus replied carefully, using the formal language that would give him room to navigate whatever classified waters he was about to enter. Harrison nodded, understanding the delicate balance Marcus was walking. Sergeant, I'm going to read you into something that requires your absolute discretion. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this conversation. Corporal Chen is not who her personnel file indicates. The colonel paused, studying Marcus's reaction before continuing. She's part of a classified program that has been placing female special operations personnel in conventional units as cover for specific missions. Her real training background includes advanced combat skills, intelligence gathering, and specialized reconnaissance. The convoy she was traveling with wasn't random. She was conducting surveillance on suspected insurgent supply routes. Marcus felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Chen's physical conditioning, her tactical awareness, her disciplined response to injury, all of it made sense now. But it also raised new questions about her medical treatment and what kind of care she would need during recovery. Sir, her injuries were significant but not career-ending, Marcus reported. Shrapnel wounds, muscle trauma, but no damage to major organs or bones. With proper rehabilitation, she should make a full recovery. However, I did notice indicators that suggested advanced combat training. Harrison leaned forward, interested. What kind of indicators? Muscle development consistent with specialized physical training. Callus patterns on her hands that suggested rope work and weapons handling. Tactical awareness even while injured. An operational discipline that went beyond standard military bearing. Marcus explained. She maintained what appeared to be operational security protocols even while unconscious and during initial treatment. The colonel smiled grimly. That's exactly the kind of training we've invested in her. The program she's part of represents years of specialized instruction and millions of dollars in development. We can't afford to lose operators of her caliber, which is why I need to know about any factors that might affect her recovery or her ability to return to duty. Marcus considered the implications of what he was hearing. Female special operations personnel were still rare, and the idea of embedding them in conventional units for extended cover operations represented a significant evolution in military strategy. But it also meant that standard medical protocols might not be sufficient for Chen's situation. Colonel, there are aspects of her recovery that will need special consideration, Marcus said. Her conditioning suggests she's been maintaining physical standards well above normal Army requirements. The psychological impact of being wounded while undercover could also present unique challenges that standard military counseling might not address adequately. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why I'm here, Sergeant. We need medical personnel who understand the unique aspects of special operations to be involved in her care. Your SEAL background makes you uniquely qualified to understand both her training and her needs during recovery. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another helicopter, this one carrying wounded from a different engagement. As medical personnel rushed to receive the new casualties, Harrison stepped closer to Marcus. Sergeant, I'm going to make an unusual request. Corporal Chen will be transferred to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany for continued treatment. I want you to accompany her as part of the medical team. Your role will be to monitor her recovery and ensure that any special considerations related to her actual background are properly addressed. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd treated many special operations personnel during his career, but never someone operating under such deep cover that even her medical treatment required classified protocols. Sir, I understand the importance of what you're asking, but I also need to know what kind of support structure will be in place for her recovery. If she's been operating undercover for an extended period, the transition back to her real identity could present significant challenges. Harrison's expression became more serious. That's part of what makes this situation complex, Sergeant. Chen has been in her cover identity for over 18 months. During that time, she's formed genuine relationships with the soldiers in her unit. People who know her only as a logistics specialist from Ohio, who joined the Army to pay for college. The explosion that wounded her also killed 2 soldiers from her unit, soldiers who thought of her as a close friend. The implications hit Marcus immediately. Chen wasn't just dealing with physical wounds and the challenge of maintaining operational security. She was also processing grief and trauma related to relationships that were real to her, even if her identity within those relationships had been fabricated. Sir, with respect, that level of psychological complexity goes well beyond standard combat stress. She's going to need specialized support that understands both her real background and the emotional reality of her cover identity. Harrison nodded grimly. Exactly why we need someone like you involved in her care, Sergeant. Someone who understands the unique pressures of special operations and can help bridge the gap between her medical needs and her operational requirements. As they spoke, Marcus realized that Chen's recovery would be unlike anything he'd encountered in his medical career. She wasn't just a wounded soldier, she was a deep cover operator whose very survival might depend on maintaining her fabricated identity while healing from both physical and psychological wounds that her cover story couldn't adequately explain. The flight to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center stretched across 8 hours, giving Marcus his first extended opportunity to observe Sarah Chen in a controlled environment. She lay on the medical transport stretcher, connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs, but her eyes remained alert and watchful, despite the pain medication flowing through her system. During the flight, Marcus noticed behaviors that reinforced his growing understanding of Chen's true background. She tracked the movement of every person in the aircraft, automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes even in her wounded state. When turbulence caused some medical equipment to shift, her hand instinctively moved toward where a weapon would normally be holstered, a reflexive action that spoke to deeply ingrained combat training. Most revealing was her interaction with the other wounded soldiers on the transport. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, who'd lost his left leg to the same IED explosion that had wounded Chen, kept trying to engage her in conversation about their shared experience. But Chen's responses were carefully measured, revealing nothing about her actual mission or training while maintaining the persona of a frightened logistics soldier. Sarah, I can't believe we made it out of there, Torres said during one of his wakeful moments. When that thing went off, I thought we were all done for. You were so calm, though, helping coordinate the casualty evacuation even with all that blood. Where'd you learn to stay so cool under pressure? Marcus watched Chen's face carefully as she formulated her response. For just a moment, he saw her calculating how much truth she could reveal without breaking her cover. I guess I just went into shock or something, she replied, her voice carrying just the right amount of uncertainty and trauma. Everything happened so fast. I don't really remember much after the explosion. But Marcus had read the after-action reports. Chen hadn't gone into shock at all. According to witness statements, she'd immediately taken charge of the casualty evacuation. applying tourniquets and organizing the surviving soldiers with the efficiency of someone trained in combat medical procedures. Her actions had saved at least 2 lives, but she couldn't acknowledge that level of competence without raising questions about her background. As the aircraft crossed into European airspace, Marcus made his way to Chen's stretcher under the pretense of checking her IV lines. Leaning close enough that only she could hear him over the engine noise, he spoke quietly. "Corporal, when we reach Germany, there are going to be additional debriefings and medical evaluations. Is there anything about your condition or your experience that I should be aware of as your treating physician?" Chen studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus could see her weighing how much she could trust him. Finally, she spoke in a voice so low it was barely audible. "Sergeant, there are aspects of my situation that are complex. I may need medical care that takes into account factors not reflected in my standard personnel file." It was a carefully worded admission that confirmed everything Marcus suspected while remaining vague enough to maintain plausible deniability if their conversation was overheard. Chen was acknowledging that she needed specialized care without explicitly breaking operational security. "Understood, Corporal. I'll make sure your treatment plan addresses all relevant factors," Marcus replied, matching her careful phrasing. The landing at Ramstein Air Base was smooth, and Chen was quickly transferred to an ambulance for the short drive to Landstuhl. As the medical convoy made its way through the German countryside, Marcus reflected on the unusual nature of his assignment. He'd been given access to classified information about Chen's real background, but he was also responsible for helping maintain her cover while ensuring she received appropriate care. At Landstuhl, Chen was admitted to a private room in a wing of the hospital, typically reserved for special operations personnel. The official reason was her need for specialized orthopedic care, but Marcus knew the real purpose was to provide a secure environment where she could begin transitioning between her cover identity and her actual background. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins, the attending physician assigned to Chen's case, briefed Marcus on the unique challenges they would face during her recovery. Dr. Hawkins had security clearance and experience treating special operations personnel, making her one of the few medical professionals qualified to understand Chen's situation. "Sergeant Rivera, Corporal Chen's physical injuries are healing well, but we're dealing with psychological factors that complicate her treatment," Dr. Hawkins explained during their first consultation. "She's been living a fabricated identity for over 18 months, forming genuine emotional connections with people who knew her only as her cover personality. The trauma of losing fellow soldiers while maintaining that cover has created a complex psychological situation." Marcus nodded, having observed some of these challenges during the flight. Chen was grieving for soldiers who had died thinking they knew her, while she was unable to fully process that grief without revealing the deception that had defined their relationships. "Doctor, how do we balance her need to maintain operational security with her need for psychological healing?" Marcus asked. "Very carefully," Dr. Hawkins replied. "We've arranged for her to have sessions with a psychologist who specializes in deep cover operations. But even those sessions will need to navigate the line between her real identity and her cover story." Over the following days, Marcus watched Chen struggle with the psychological complexity of her situation. During official visits from her supposed unit members, she maintained perfect composure as the logistics specialist they believed her to be. But during private medical consultations, glimpses of her real training and background would emerge. The most difficult moment came when Torres, who was also recovering at Landstuhl, visited Chen's room. He was struggling with his own trauma and had fixated on Chen as someone who understood what they'd been through together. But Chen couldn't reciprocate that emotional connection without risking her cover. "Sarah, we need to stay in touch when we get home," Torres said, sitting beside her bed. "You're the only person who really knows what happened out there. My family tries to understand, but they weren't there. You were." Marcus watched Chen's face as she struggled to respond appropriately. She couldn't tell Torres that her understanding of combat trauma came from years of special operations training, not from their shared experience as logistics soldiers. But she also couldn't dismiss the genuine emotional need he was expressing. "Mike, I think we both need time to process everything that happened," she replied carefully. "Maybe we should focus on getting better first, and then see how we feel about staying connected." It was a masterful response that acknowledged Torres's emotional needs, while avoiding commitments that could compromise her future operations. But Marcus could see the toll that maintaining such careful deception was taking on her recovery. Chen was healing from physical wounds while simultaneously managing the psychological burden of living a lie with people who genuinely cared about the person they thought she was. 3 weeks into Chen's recovery at Landstuhl, Marcus began to see cracks in her carefully maintained facade. The physical wounds were healing ahead of schedule. Her exceptional conditioning was accelerating. The process mattered, but the psychological strain of maintaining her dual identity was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The turning point came during a seemingly routine physical therapy session. Chen was working with a rehabilitation specialist on rebuilding strength in her injured shoulder when another patient entered the gym. Captain David Kim, a Special Forces officer recovering from a helicopter crash, immediately recognized something familiar in Chen's movement patterns. Marcus was observing the session when Kim approached Chen's exercise station. The two made eye contact, and Marcus saw a moment of recognition pass between them. Kim had clearly identified Chen as someone with advanced combat training, while Chen realized she'd been compromised by someone qualified to recognize special operations conditioning. "Excuse me," Kim said to the physical therapist. "Could I borrow your patient for a moment? I think we might have some mutual acquaintances." The therapist stepped away, leaving Chen and Kim alone except for Marcus, who remained at his observation post. Marcus strained to hear their conversation over the noise of other patients working with exercise equipment. "You're not logistics," Kim said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. "The way you move, your conditioning, the precision in your exercises, your special operations." "What unit?" Chen's face remained neutral, but Marcus could see the internal debate playing out behind her eyes. She was being directly challenged by someone with the expertise to see through her cover, but acknowledging the truth would violate every protocol she'd been trained to follow. "Captain, I think you might be mistaken," Chen replied, maintaining her cover story. "I'm just a supply specialist who's been trying to stay in shape. The Army fitness standards keep getting tougher." But Kim wasn't convinced. He'd spent enough years around special operations personnel to recognize the subtle indicators that separated elite operators from conventional soldiers. Chen's response had been too measured, too carefully calculated for someone who should have been flattered by the misidentification. "Listen, I'm not trying to compromise anything," Kim said, his voice carrying the understanding of someone who knew about classified operations. "But I've been where you are. Maintaining cover while recovering from wounds is harder than people realize. If you need someone who understands the unique pressures, I'm here." Marcus watched Chen's composure finally begin to crack. The offer of genuine understanding from someone who recognized her true background was exactly what she needed. But accepting it would require admitting that her entire public identity was fabricated. "Captain, I appreciate the offer, but I think you're reading more into the situation than actually exists," Chen replied. But her voice carried a note of exhaustion that hadn't been there before. Kim nodded, recognizing the bind she was in. "Of course, but if you ever want to talk about fitness routines or training methods, I'm in room 312. Sometimes comparing notes with fellow soldiers can be helpful for recovery." After Kim left, Chen continued her physical therapy with mechanical precision. But Marcus could see that something fundamental had shifted. The encounter had reminded her of who she really was beneath the cover identity, and the contrast was becoming harder to manage. That evening, Marcus made an unprecedented decision. He requested a private consultation with Chen outside normal medical protocols. Using his security clearance, he arranged for them to meet in a secured conference room, typically used for classified briefings. "Corporal Chen," Marcus began once they were alone in the soundproof room, "I think we need to have a conversation about your recovery that goes beyond standard medical care." Chen looked up from her wheelchair, and for the first time since he'd treated her, Marcus saw genuine vulnerability in her expression. "Sergeant, I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, but without the careful calculation that usually marked her responses. "I mean that maintaining operational security while dealing with combat. Trauma and grief is putting stress on your recovery that standard medical protocols don't address," Marcus said directly. "And I think you're reaching a point where that stress is becoming counterproductive to your healing." Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her struggling with the decision of whether to trust him with her real situation. "Hypothetically, she said finally, choosing her words carefully. If someone were in a situation where they had to maintain a professional facade while dealing with personal trauma, what kind of support might help them manage that balance? Marcus understood she was asking for help without explicitly breaking her cover, even in this secured environment. Hypothetically, he replied, matching her careful phrasing, that person might benefit from having someone who understands both aspects of their situation, someone who could help them process the reality of their experience while maintaining necessary professional boundaries. And hypothetically, would that person be able to access such support without compromising their professional obligations? Chen asked. Marcus leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. Corporal, there are medical support systems designed specifically for personnel in unique operational situations. Those systems understand that sometimes the most effective treatment requires accommodating factors that can't be discussed in standard medical records. For the first time since the explosion, Chen allowed her professional mask to slip slightly. The exhaustion and emotional strain she'd been hiding became visible in her posture and expression. Sergeant, I've been Sarah Chen, the logistics specialist, for so long that sometimes I forget who I really am underneath, she admitted quietly. The people in my unit who died, they cared about Sarah Chen. They trusted her, relied on her, and she let them down by not being real. Marcus realized they'd reached the heart of Chen's psychological struggle. She wasn't just dealing with survivor's guilt and combat trauma. She was wrestling with the moral complexity of having formed genuine emotional connections while living a fabricated identity. Those soldiers cared about the person you were with them, Marcus said carefully. The fact that some aspects of your identity were operational doesn't diminish the reality of those relationships or the value you provided to your unit. Chen shook her head. But they died thinking they knew me, and they never really did. How do I process grief for people who cared about someone who doesn't actually exist? It was a question that went to the heart of deep cover operations, and one that Marcus realized would require more than medical treatment to resolve. Chen needed help integrating her real identity with the emotional experiences she'd had while undercover, and that was a psychological challenge that few medical professionals were qualified to address. 6 months after the IED explosion that had nearly ended her career, Chen stood in a nondescript office building in Northern Virginia, preparing for her return to active duty. The physical therapy had been successful beyond expectations. Her conditioning was actually better than before her injury. But the real transformation had been psychological, and that change was about to be put to its ultimate test. Marcus had been reassigned to a medical unit at Walter Reed, but he'd maintained contact with Chen's case through official channels. The unique nature of her recovery had become a template for treating other deep cover operatives who experienced similar psychological challenges. Her successful integration of multiple identities was being studied as a model for future cases. Colonel Harrison was present for Chen's return briefing, along with several other JSOC personnel who'd been following her recovery. The meeting was held in a classified facility where Chen could finally discuss her true background and experiences without operational security concerns. Corporal Chen, Colonel Harrison began, your recovery has been remarkable, both physically and psychologically. The medical team reports that you've not only returned to full operational capacity, but that you've developed enhanced psychological resilience that makes you more effective than before your injury. Chen nodded, her posture reflecting the confidence that came from months of intensive rehabilitation and psychological integration. Sir, the experience taught me that maintaining operational effectiveness doesn't require sacrificing emotional authenticity. I can form genuine relationships within my cover identity while maintaining the psychological boundaries necessary for mission success. This was exactly what the Special Operations community had hoped to achieve. Chen had proven that deep cover operatives could process normal human emotions and relationships without compromising their operational security. It was a breakthrough that would reshape how such missions were planned and executed. Marcus, who'd been invited to observe the briefing, watched Chen demonstrate the integration Dr. Wells had worked so hard to achieve. She spoke about her time with the logistics unit with genuine affection for her fellow soldiers, while simultaneously discussing tactical lessons learned and intelligence gathered during her deployment. The two aspects of her experience were no longer in conflict. The soldiers in my unit were good people doing important work, Chen explained to the briefing panel. The fact that I was there for operational reasons doesn't diminish the value of what they accomplished, or the legitimacy of the relationships we formed. Understanding that distinction was crucial to processing the trauma of losing them. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, interested in this perspective. How do you think this psychological integration will affect your future operational effectiveness? Chen considered the question carefully before responding. Sir, I believe it makes me more effective. Previous deep cover training focused on maintaining emotional distance to protect operational security. But I've learned that selective emotional engagement can actually enhance cover effectiveness, while providing better intelligence gathering opportunities. People trust someone who demonstrates authentic human connections. This was a sophisticated understanding of deep cover psychology that few operatives ever achieved. Chen had learned to use genuine emotion as an operational tool while maintaining the psychological boundaries necessary to protect classified information and mission objectives. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Captain Kim, the Special Forces officer who'd recognized Chen's background during her recovery, had been invited to participate in the debrief. His recognition of her true identity at Landstuhl had become part of the lessons learned from her case. Corporal Chen, Kim said, taking a seat at the conference table, I want to apologize for potentially compromising your cover during your recovery. I didn't realize the complexity of your operational situation. Chen smiled, showing a confidence that hadn't been present during their encounter in Germany. Captain, your recognition was actually helpful. It reminded me that maintaining cover doesn't require abandoning my real identity completely. There's a difference between operational security and personal denial. Marcus realized this interaction represented the final validation of Chen's psychological recovery. She was able to discuss her compromised cover without defensiveness or anxiety, demonstrating that she'd developed the emotional resilience necessary for continued special operations work. Colonel Harrison reviewed the documents in front of him before addressing Chen's future assignment. Corporal, based on your successful recovery and the psychological insights you've developed, we're prepared to offer you an enhanced role in the Deep Cover program. You would be responsible not only for operational missions, but also for training other personnel in the psychological techniques you've mastered. It was an unprecedented offer that recognized Chen as more than just an operator who'd overcome adversity. She was being acknowledged as someone who'd contributed to the evolution of deep cover methodology through her recovery process. Chen accepted the assignment with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her initial treatment. Sir, I believe my experiences can help other operatives avoid some of the psychological pitfalls that complicated my own recovery. If sharing those lessons can improve operational effectiveness while protecting personnel well-being, I'm committed to that mission. As the briefing concluded, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary journey he'd witnessed. Chen had entered his medical tent as a wounded soldier, maintaining desperate operational security. She was leaving as a recovered operator who'd contributed to advancing the entire field of deep cover psychology. The silence that had first drawn Marcus's attention to Chen's unique situation had transformed into something entirely different. It was no longer the defensive quiet of someone protecting secrets, but the confident composure of someone who'd learned to integrate all aspects of their identity while maintaining professional effectiveness. Years later, Marcus would encounter other deep cover operatives whose training included psychological techniques developed from Chen's case. Her recovery had become a foundational example of how military medicine could adapt to support personnel operating in the complex psychological environment of modern warfare. The woman who'd been wounded but silent had found her voice, and that voice was now teaching others how to navigate the challenging intersection of authentic human experience and operational necessity. In learning to heal herself, Chen had helped heal an entire approach to deep cover operations, proving that psychological authenticity and operational security could coexist when properly understood and integrated. The mission was complete, but in ways that none of them had anticipated. When Marcus first noticed the unusual quiet of a wounded soldier, who revealed more through her silence than most people revealed through speech. The breakthrough in Chen's treatment came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Wells, a civilian psychologist who specialized in identity disorders and had previously worked with intelligence agencies, arrived at Landstuhl specifically to consult on Chen's case. Unlike military medical personnel, Dr. Wells had experience helping deep cover operatives process the psychological challenges of extended identity deception. Marcus was present when Dr. Wells conducted her first session with Chen in the secured conference room. The psychologist's approach was unlike anything Marcus had observed in military medical settings. She immediately acknowledged the reality of Chen's situation without requiring her to explicitly break operational security. "I want to start by recognizing that you've been carrying an extraordinary psychological burden," Dr. Wells began. "Living as someone else for an extended period while forming genuine emotional connections creates a unique form of stress that most people never experience. You're not just dealing with combat trauma. You're processing the complex reality of having multiple authentic identities." Chen's response was immediate and emotional. For the first time since her injury, she began to cry. Not the controlled tears of someone maintaining composure, but the raw emotional release of someone finally being understood. "Doctor, I don't know who I am anymore," Chen admitted. "When I'm with the soldiers from my unit, I have to be Sarah from Ohio who joined the Army to pay for college. But that person isn't real, except that the relationships I formed as her are real. The people who died believed in her, trusted her, and I can't even properly grieve for them because doing so might compromise everything I've worked for." Dr. Wells nodded with the understanding of someone who'd helped other operatives through similar crises. "What you're experiencing is called identity fragmentation, and it's a recognized psychological condition among long-term undercover personnel. The solution isn't to choose between your identities. It's to integrate them in a way that honors both your operational requirements and your emotional needs." Over the following weeks, Marcus observed Dr. Wells working with Chen to develop coping strategies that acknowledge the reality of her dual existence. Rather than forcing her to abandon either identity, the treatment focused on helping her understand that both versions of herself were authentic expressions of her core personality adapted to different circumstances. The woman who comforted dying soldiers and organized casualty evacuations wasn't fake, Dr. Wells explained during one session. She was you, using your real skills and genuine compassion within the framework of your cover identity. The relationships you formed were real, even if some facts about your background were classified. This perspective began to transform how Chen processed her experiences. Instead of viewing her cover identity as a betrayal of her fellow soldiers, she started to understand it as a necessary tool that had allowed her to serve alongside them while accomplishing critical mission objectives. Marcus also noticed changes in Chen's physical recovery as her psychological healing progressed. Her appetite improved, her sleep patterns normalized, and her participation in physical therapy became more focused and determined. The integration of her dual identities was eliminating the psychological stress that had been impeding her healing. The most significant test came when Torres requested another visit before his transfer back to the United States. Chen had been dreading this conversation since beginning her psychological treatment, knowing that she would need to maintain her cover story while processing genuine emotions about their shared trauma. Marcus observed the visit from outside Chen's room, ready to intervene if she showed signs of psychological distress. But instead, he witnessed something remarkable. Chen was able to engage authentically with Torres while maintaining appropriate operational security. She acknowledged their shared experience and expressed genuine care for his recovery, without revealing classified information about her background. "Mike, I want you to know that what we went through together was real," Chen told Torres. "The fact that we survived when others didn't creates a bond between us that doesn't depend on knowing everything about each other's backgrounds. I hope you find peace with what happened, and I hope your recovery goes well." Torres seemed satisfied with this response, and Marcus realized that Chen had found a way to honor both her emotional needs and her operational requirements. She was acknowledging the reality of their relationship without compromising her cover identity. Dr. Wells later explained to Marcus that this integration was the goal of treatment for deep cover operatives. "The objective isn't to eliminate the emotional complexity of their situation," she said. "It's to help them develop the psychological tools needed to maintain both their operational effectiveness and their emotional well-being." As Chen's discharge date approached, Marcus found himself reflecting on the unique nature of her recovery. She'd healed from physical wounds that would have ended the careers of many soldiers. But more importantly, she'd developed the psychological resilience needed to continue operating in the complex world of deep cover intelligence work. During their final medical consultation, Chen demonstrated the integration Dr. Wells had been working toward. She was simultaneously the highly trained special operations professional and the compassionate soldier who'd served with distinction in a logistics unit. Both identities were authentic expressions of who she was, adapted to different operational requirements. "Sergeant Rivera," Chen said as Marcus completed her final medical evaluation, "I want to thank you for understanding that my situation required more than standard medical care. The support you provided made it possible for me to heal in ways that will allow me to continue serving effectively." Marcus realized that Chen's recovery represented something larger than individual medical treatment. It demonstrated the military's growing understanding that modern warfare required supporting personnel who operated in psychological environments that previous generations of soldiers had never encountered. The silence that had characterized Chen's initial treatment had evolved into something different, not the defensive quiet of someone protecting secrets, but the confident composure of someone who'd learned to integrate all aspects of their identity into a cohesive whole. She was ready to return to duty, whatever form that duty might take.